Hello and welcome back to the One Take Show. In this episode, we are in conversation with Mr. Shravan Kumar Yamanur. Sir is a practicing advocate and previously he has been a consultant for Department for Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade and also Department for Economic Affairs. In this episode, we talk about Sir's journey with law, his experience with the legal industry. We also talk about one of my favorite topics, that is international investment arbitration, and especially looking at it from an Indian perspective. So if you like this episode, make sure you like, share and subscribe to the channel. If you have any suggestions or feedbacks, write them down in the comment section. I would love to read them. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let's start the podcast.
You want something, go get it. Period.
And one, we are recording. Hello, sir. Welcome to the One Take Show. I am so excited to have this conversation. I think everyone who's at all ever followed either disputes or international arbitration, international law in general, absolutely loves your journey and wants to learn more and more about it. And I think to have this opportunity to speak with you and to learn from your really valuable experience, something that is so unique and something so celebrated, is really a golden opportunity. So thank you so much for joining me for this conversation, and thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Kaustav. It's good to be on your show.
Thank you so much, sir. Sir, before we begin and start talking about the illustrious theme that we have, and I truly believe that anyone who's interested in this would definitely get a lot to learn from this episode. I think there is a lot that we can learn from your own personal experience, and as in how what inspired you to get into law, and what has been your journey so far with law, and what have been your major takeaways from it. So maybe we can start with that, sir.
Yeah, sure. So I had a checkered, history in that manner, if you look at it, because I initially began after my 12th grade in engineering. So I did a year of engineering, but somehow it didn't feel, I wasn't really happy there. So I decided that I should be doing something that suits my set of skills. And that's when, by chance, someone in my family told me that there is something called national law schools. So I'm from Hyderabad, and in Hyderabad, people are focused on IIT engineering. So that was my limited knowledge as well. But once I found out there are something like national law schools, and it's not that you just have to be typically in rural India and generally in cities, they feel lawyers are, pleaders under, sitting under a tree. So, so I had a similar impression, to be honest. And though I knew lawyers abroad and attorneys, in USA or in UK, etc., well, it's a respected profession. I never had a chance to really interact with a lawyer before. So that was my journey. And then when I found out there are national law schools, I wrote the common law admission test, and I joined Nual's coaching. So that's the National Law School in Kerala. So I did my 5-year course there, and it was a wonderful time in college. I did a number of moot court competitions and various competitions there. I was also a debater in college. So I enjoyed my time, and that was when I initially my interest was in international relations even prior to joining law school. So that led me to also get interested in international law. So that was the journey for me. And I had wonderful teachers who, like one of our professors, Mr. Hari. So he was our teacher who taught us public international law. And it really opened my eyes to see the use of rule of law, and recognizing how, public international law is no longer just a soft law. There are so many ways for enforcement of public international law today. And it was in that context that I learned about international investment treaties, where a private individual is able to enforce their rights under international law. And so how I got fascinated in internet to with this subject.
Right, sir. I'm absolutely giddy and excited about this because I think I've already told you that sort of had one session where we have seeked your guidance on our preparation for FDI moot. But right now, I think I've completely fallen in love with international investment treaty arbitration. And I think anyone who's listening to this, the reason why I keep saying this, because it's perhaps not that commonplace because I've not really interacted with a lot of seniors who are specifically working in international law, and that too boiling it down to international investment treaty. But you've had a very celebrated experience recently. So you've been working. You previously worked, I believe, with Department of External Affairs, and then you've recently started working with. I don't want to get this wrong, so I'm going to read this right for this episode. It is Department of
It's
Promotion of
long.
Industry and Internal Trade, right, sir?
Yeah.
And you've been working as a consultant. So I just want to understand, like, how did this trajectory formulate itself? Was it like you've targeted it throughout your law school and then entering into the industry, or did it just happen after one step at a time?
Yeah, so from law school, when I stepped out, so for me, dispute resolution has been my main area of interest always. So while I do enjoy international arbitration and I enjoy international law, for me, it's as an individual, I enjoy oral advocacy, and so it's for me even court practice is equally fun. And I believe a lawyer should be wholesome and have a knowledge of both international law and have a strong grounding in their domestic law. So where I initially stepped out and joined as an in-house counsel in a company, but there it was more of a contract kind of work, which was not my cup of tea. So that's when I realized, okay, this isn't the way I want to go ahead. I want to be in dispute resolution. I want to do international disputes eventually, but before that I wanted to have a decent understanding of litigation. Though I had done a few internships with leading senior advocates, including Mr. PP Rao and Mr. KTS Tulsi in Supreme Court. But I mean, as an intern, you really don't get involved in the actual practice. So that's the reason I stepped out. I joined Mr. Rajiv Datta. He is a senior advocate in the Supreme Court of India, and he has previously acted as as an arbitrator in some ICC arbitrations. He's done a few other international arbitrations, and he is a member of the IBA, I think the IBA board for mediation. So I felt that would give me a platform and an experience to get into international disputes. So that's how I joined his office. I was there for a few years, assisted him in some arbitrations as you can say like a tribunal secretary. And in addition to that, obviously, I was assisting him as a junior counsel before the Supreme Court of India and the Delhi High Court. So while this was happening, I was still keen to explore my opportunities. Like uh, I knew this was a stepping stone, but eventually I want to pursue public international law or international investment treaty, etc. And I was regularly following, wrote a few articles on the subject and was regularly following this area. And that's when the Department of Economic Affairs in the Ministry of Finance, which is the leading agency of India for negotiating investment treaties and for handling the investment disputes, they came out with a notification seeking applications for a legal cell that they were creating at that time. And this was in 2015. So they came out with a notification, and even now frequently they do come out with notifications. So any of the listeners, any of the viewers who may be interested in that, I think that's one thing you should keep a lookout for opportunities on through. It can be, you have a lot of websites and blogs nowadays which follow government jobs. So that was how I identified this post, and I was really astonished because it really fit what I wanted to do, and it came at the right time in my career when I had graduated. I had a few years of experience as a counsel, and I felt this would help me. So I took it. Was at that time there were a lot of questions in my mind as well, whether that's a good step, moving away from practice, being a consultant with government. Should I do that? Should I go for a master's, or should I join the government. So obviously there were many questions in my mind, but I knew that this was a unique experience, and I also wasn't sure how often such an opportunity would come by. So I applied for the position, interviewed for it. So there were a bunch of IAS officers and I think Indian Economic Service officers who were on the interview board, and I got waitlisted. Actually, I didn't get selected. I was on the wait list, and pretty much after that, I thought, okay, that didn't happen. And at that time, I didn't even know that there was a wait list. I thought that's limited to railway tickets, but I realized that okay, there is something like this in government, even for government posts. Later on, when I was informed when I joined, so a year after that, I got a call from the government, and they told me that okay, you had been waitlisted a year ago. There is a vacancy now. If you're interested to join, please do join us. And I just grabbed the opportunity. I said, okay, this is something I really want to do. And in the meanwhile, I had completed a postgraduate diploma in international law and diplomacy, because as I said, my interest remained, and I felt, being while I was working in Supreme Court and while I was doing a lot of domestic law, just to hone my skills and to keep in touch with the subject, I completed the diploma course from the Indian Society of International Law. And so I had the diploma, and it helped me when I joined Department of Economic Affairs as a legal associate, and started a journey in negotiation of these treaties, and formulating the policy on investment issues before G20, WTO, BRICS, all these kind of multilateral forums. So along with the legal aspects, there were policy issues involved, and that was what motivated me to join the Department of Economic Affairs at that time.
Right.
uh, yeah.
No, please
So
continue.
yeah, no. So I joined DEA, and it was fascinating to negotiate treaties. And at that age, a few years into my practice, to get an opportunity to actually sit at the table on behalf of Republic of India and negotiate a treaty, it was a very good feeling. And I must say that many of the officers who I interacted with, they were always welcoming. They trusted our advice, and there's a lot of camaraderie. And with that kind of an environment, we had a good opportunity to really contribute even during the negotiations, to speak on behalf of Republic of India, to arrive at solutions. And this was interesting for me, especially because prior to this, I was part of an adversarial system, where as a counsel, you're trying to show that you're right. But when it comes to treaty negotiations here, it was completely different. We had to arrive at a solution, and make the other side equally comfortable. And often that requires you to hone down, to actually s- try to stop being an advocate, but be more of a negotiator. And that was really a good experience for me. It helped me grow as an individual, and also as a lawyer. I feel that it gave me a new perspective on how to approach the subject. And we've interacted I've interacted with I've represented India in bilateral negotiations, and I was part of the negotiating team for RCEP, which was a large mega trade deal with 16 countries. So I've seen these plurilateral negotiations, and I must say that I've made a lot of friends in that journey. A lot of the negotiators from the other countries I have today are friends. And we had our differences, obviously, while representing our countries, but it's really beautiful to see how people with different cultures, different languages, different view of the world, but they get together, and we're all basically the same. So I think if you have that in mind, it's easy to arrive at solutions on the negotiation table. So that was my experience in DEA. Now, along with negotiations, as I said, there were disputes. India obviously hires outside law firms and and councils to represent the Republic of India. We unlike the United States, for example, which has an in-house team that represents United States before all for all investment treaty disputes. India continues to engage external law firms and councils. So we played more of a role in ensuring that what was being said by the councils, what was being filed by the councils, is in line with our policies, is in line with our future negotiations, is in line with international investment law, because we continue to deal with it on a daily basis. So that was more of our it was a more limited work there, but we were keenly involved in the disputes and in trying to, and the benefit of that was that we could use that experience even in our negotiations. So while we continue to negotiate our treaties, the experience in the disputes or would help us in our negotiations, and at times something we learn in our negotiation would be useful in giving advice in the treaty disputes. So it was so that was the mixed experience that was there in Department of Economic Affairs. I was there for almost 3 years, and after subsequent to that, I have my practice, and I work with a law firm, T&A Law Offices. We represent the Republic of India in a few investment treaty disputes. And in addition to that, I also advise the department, as the long name that you try to repeat. So DPIIT. So earlier it was when I joined, it was before I joined, it was called DIPP. It's now called DPIIT. So I joined there in the FDI policy section, where I advised them on India's policy stand in international forums. So as I said, so the experience I had in DA on policy issues before G20 or WTO or BRICS, SCO. So a lot of multilateral organization nowadays, a lot of acronyms. So before them, to have a consistent investment policy and mandate, and to ensure that what we are saying is in our interest. So that's the attempt there. Along with that, I do deal with a few concerning the reform of the FDI policy that goes on. So the experience I've had in DA has helped me assist them in that. So that's my current role right now.
Right, right, sir. And I think you working in with domestic laws and having a practice in Supreme Court, has that specifically helped you out? Because my previous conversations with any advocate who's or a lawyer who's working in international law, maybe international arbitration, they've preferred or they've chosen a path of LLM from foreign universities, and then choosing to work in international law firms, and that's how they've entered that field. So you were decided to go about a different route, and that has landed you working with the government of India itself. So what is your comment on that, sir?
Yeah, I think that is the traditional way, and no doubt, I think that's the more common way as well. Even now, it makes sense, because doing a master's and then going abroad, you do have a lot of opportunities. Though I see now that many students are going for LLM, so there is a fierce competition, and you have good quality lawyers in India. You have good quality law students and lawyers who are going out and are working with these law firms. I also observe that I've been observing this trend that many people are doing a LLM and even coming back to India, and then they work with law firms here. So no doubt, any masters in a field will help you study that in depth, and that will give you certain set of skills. But for me, it just so happened that I got this opportunity to learn while working. So even though I may not have a master's in international investment law, the fact is that having worked 3 years negotiating those treaties, interacting, as I said, and some of the negotiators on the other side were really amazing. Like, I can recall a few countries. where the negotiators were really experienced, and we learned a lot even about the subject while interacting with them. So that I think this is an approach which is useful if you want to be in India, if you're getting an opportunity, and you can always go for a LLM. I think it's in India that we have this uncalled for pressure of doing certain things within a certain age limit. But when you go abroad, that's not how things are. So people are more flexible. They do realize they'll gain some experience and then do their masters. So that's always an approach. But for me, as I said, since my interest continues to be acting as a counsel, to develop further my skills as a as a in oral advocacy, and to represent people in courts. I felt that for me, a master's at this stage wouldn't make sense, because going to Supreme Court or going to the High Court allows me to continue to expand my understanding of domestic law, to use my experience. So it's a given. As I said, I try to translate whatever experience I have in domestic law into international law, and at times I learn something in the international law sphere or from the international law firms, which I find very useful when I'm practicing domestic law. So, and that's the reason I prefer this route. You obviously, going abroad, it's better pay. You may have better living conditions as well. But I don't know if you'll. I mean, there are many other factors. Like if you want to be in India, you feel that India is growing, and that's why I said there's so many good lawyers today in India. We are a leading field. So I envisage, going ahead, where India can be the country that's providing this kind of legal advice. Today, people go to London, they go to New York, and they engage law firms all the way from East Asia, all the way from Africa. They're going to Europe, they're going to America, and they're engaging law firms. So on the other hand, if they engage law firms from India, if they engage lawyers in India who are well versed with international law, who are well versed with international investment law, for example, we can provide them services at a much reasonable rate, and retain the same quality of work. And that I think that's where India is uniquely poised, with our ability to speak English, with the English common law background, and being a global powerhouse, being this economic powerhouse today. We have the ability to do that in the near future. So I feel
Right.
I want to explore that kind of work.
Mhm.
And going abroad, secondly, for me, was that if I did go abroad, I don't think I would have this experience in the local courts there, because
Right.
there it's you have a clearly divided work, and the lawyers there who are doing international work are unlikely to appear in the local courts or be developing their skills in domestic law. But here I've fortunately I'm getting an opportunity to hone my skills in domestic law, represent go to courts, and also continue to be in the international law sphere. So I think to each his own journey, and that's the beauty of life, and that's how it should be.
Right, right, sir. And I think you already said this, that you've always enjoyed the practice of law that involves the oral speaking, and I think you wouldn't have, or anyone wouldn't have gotten that opportunity if they resorted to LLM or going abroad and settling. As you suggested, that it is something that comes with the virtue of practicing in courts in India and learning about the domestic law, and then possibly applying that in your practice anywhere for that matter. With that, sir, I think you've also mentioned that now with the law firm that you're working, and the advisory or the consultancy or your engagement with DPIIT, now you're working in close tandems with international investment law. So, if I were to ask you, sir, what are your major takeaways from this experience right now, and what is it that you would advise the students or the fresh legal aspirants who possibly seek to follow your footsteps, and what is it that they can do that you believe should be done by any student?
Well, even I still feel I am at the beginning of my journey. So, but despite that, with the little knowledge I've gained so far, my advice would be that to have an approach where you have a complete understanding of the subject and not narrow yourself. One must understand that arbitration is only a method of dispute settlement, right? It will have certain procedures, but what will really help you be a good advocate or be a good lawyer in this field will be a thorough understanding of the substantive laws. So you must know what is foreign investment. What it's not, investment treaty is only a part of the global regime that deals with investment law. So, for example, in India, we have the Foreign Exchange Management Act, we have an FDI policy that governs how foreign investment enters the country. So, an understanding of that, or an understanding of how foreign flows happen, what are the restrictions they're facing, what are the conditions that they're allowed, what's happening globally. Like we're seeing a trend recently where foreign investments are facing more scrutiny across the world, whether it's United States, whether it's Australia, whether it's the European Union. Everyone's issuing directives for scrutinizing foreign investments, and there's a reason behind it. There is because there's a growing understanding that one must scrutinize who is investing in your country, where the money comes from. Without doing that, allowing investment in the country can be, dangerous. And once it's there, the investment protection treaties come in, and you're bound to treat them in a particular manner. So therefore, I will say that you should understand all these aspects. And I that was one thing in DPIIT I continue to learn, and it's really fascinating to see how the FDI policy works, how investments are flowing. And so, in addition to this, you must know the substantive field. So you can see there are a lot of oil and gas disputes. There are a lot of you have construction disputes, mining disputes. So an understanding of the substantive law in those areas will make you a better lawyer when you deal with international investment law. Even though it's a bilateral investment treaty dispute, an understanding of those subjects will ensure that you can effectively represent your client. So that would be my advice to whoever's listening.
Wonderful, wonderful. So I think this level of commercial awareness, or as we say, the knowledge of not just the statutes and law, but the knowledge of the industry in totality, and to have that level of awareness about everything would definitely, as you've suggested, makes up for being a good lawyer, being a good advocate in whatever field we are practicing. And I think it is to the extension of that, I'll try to make this conversation as non-selfish as possible because all my subsequent questions about the BIT in India and the various ancillary questions that are is something that I'm personally very much vested into and want to learn about. Nonetheless, I think since you've already sort of worked in tandems with the government, and I think this allows me to ask you about how exactly is the Indian BIT, the model BIT that we have right now. What is your conceptual impression of this BIT? And before we get into the ancillary questions, what is your idea as to how exactly do you visualize our BIT as?
So, yeah, the model BIT that you have now, which was approved by the cabinet in December 2015, was a model that was created after a few decades of experience uh, post the negotiation of I'll call them the earlier generation treaties. So it was only during the 90s that India entered into this market of investment treaties. Though from the 1960s countries had began negotiating treaties, India was not keen to negotiate the treaties. And from what I understand is that the government's stand was always that we have a constitution, we have a rule of law, so there's nothing for the foreign investors to fear. We have an independent judiciary. So, I mean, we can handle. I mean, there cannot be any treatment that would be discriminatory or that would really be so unfair. So therefore, this was the stand of the government of India. But after the opening up of the economy in the 90s, I guess they were at that situation, given the status of the economy, there was, I think all the departments agreed, or throughout the government, everyone agreed that there was a need for entering into investment treaties. And that was the reason that the country began negotiating. And there was a model at that stage which suited India at that stage, where we needed certain, kind of investments, where our economy was at a certain position. So that the model BIT of the 1993 suited the situation that existed then. But in 2013 or 2014, I think the India of 2013 or 2014 was vastly different from the India that was there in 1990s. So I think that is what was reflected in the model BIT. And we must always recognize that this is not something unique to India. The evolution of a model BIT, or changing the model BIT, or is common throughout the world. So recently, the Canadians have revised their model BIT. All right, and you will see that they've also added certain elements, because what's happening is that the earlier generation BITs were so broadly worded that they were open to any kind of interpretation. There was whatever the tribunal said, whatever the tribunal felt was international law, or whatever the tribunal felt was the intention of the parties, became law. Now this when countries realize the impact that this would have, and when they realize that with more and more foreign investments entering into each country, this meant more and more interference by a tribunal, or also that the impact of these treaties would be larger than they were in the 90s. The impact was more. So that was the reason they realized we need to balance these treaties. And this is a global movement. A global movement. I would not say that this is just a Indian decision. And that's how it was in that context that India decided. And and no doubt the white industries decision must have also nudged them further. But my reading is that there was already a discussion, there was already an awareness, and our officers in government, or our politicians, they were observing and well aware of the decisions that were happening under NAFTA, or by the exit tribunals, or under other treaties. So it's not just the fact that white industries happen, but the fact that all of this together combined, and the fact globally there was a change that led to a revision of the model BIT. And this model BIT of 2015 is India's attempt to balance the rights of states to regulate with the rights of investors. So I think it's that kind of a balance that was tried to be achieved. Now there I know that many people write about the model BIT, many people have criticized the model BIT. And often I've asked a few of them, I don't want to take any names, but I've asked a few of them to even produce a model. I suggested that someone, why don't you balance the rights of the state and the investors? Create a model that balances that. I'm sure there's nothing preventing you to create such a model, publish the model, say that this is my model BIT. So I mean, this is I know that there's a lot of backlash that and I've seen it more not from the countries I've negotiated with, and that's the funny part. We've negotiated the model BIT subsequently. So when I stepped into DEA, already the model BIT was in place, and the negotiations had begun for a fresh set of BITs. And that also shows that India is not trying to go away from this global regime, or India is not delegitimizing this regime. India continues to be an active participant. And there is no doubt in my mind that, that, uh, whatever the political party may be, or whoever is in government, everyone recognizes the value that FDI brings into the country, and everyone wants that the country has a good name globally, and everyone wants to attract investment to the country to help the economy. It's just that there may be a difference in how that can be achieved, and there may be a difference in where that line lies, right? But the fact is that the model BIT is India's attempt. It's a negotiation text. It says that this is India's preferred text. That's all that the model BIT says. No one can enter a negotiation and say that this is it, this is the model BIT, we can't go beyond it. Can a negotiation occur in this manner? It cannot, and it doesn't practically. And that's not how government functions. But the way it's portrayed in Indian media, surprisingly, and that's the reason I'm saying I've seen there are a few authors or a few persons who frequently are attacking the model BIT and anything that India does in this sphere. But I feel it's a bit unfair. I don't see them equally being vocal about anything that an investor does, or anything following what even other countries do for that matter. So this is my takeaway, and I've seen the reaction of many countries. I'll tell you that much of the developing world has appreciated India's model BIT. They have actually told us that we really appreciate what India is trying to do, the change that they're trying to bring, and we are also trying to adopt something similar. And in the recent past, we are seeing those changes happening. Now, I gave you an example of the new Canadian model BIT. They have a few further restrictions on what is the minimum standard of treatment, and they have a few further restrictions on the ISDS mechanism, how it will go about, because everyone's realizing, the developed world and the developing world is realizing that we can't let a bunch of private individuals decide the fate of the sovereign. It's a legitimate way, but it must be done within a certain mandate. It cannot be unlimited. And I think that's the attempt to where it's going. The funny bit is that when it comes to two developed countries, now I'll give you an example of the recent UK Australia free trade agreement, which has an investment chapter. You'll be surprised to learn that they dropped the ISDS mechanism altogether. The countries decided we don't want investment treaty arbitration. But the same countries, when they negotiate with a developing country, insist that they will only achieve fairness, or they'll only have justice if there is investment treaty arbitration. Now, these actions are, genuinely cause concern to developing countries, to the leadership of the developing countries. Because when the developed countries are indirectly, you're indirectly trying to say that we have rule of law, you have no rule of law. The moment I agree to an investment treaty arbitration mechanism in investment treaty, what are the implications if you're having two sets of agreements for developed countries and developing countries? So this is an ongoing debate in the field. And as I said, for me, my understanding is that the model BIT is a attempt to balance the rights. No doubt, there can be, based on the experience in the negotiations, based on the fact that India is now also going to be a source of FDI going forward, and we must be aware that it's not just that India is acting as a respondent. You have a growing number of cases where Indian investors are actually filing treaty claims against foreign countries. So with that, I'm sure that the model BIT in 10 years time or 20 years time will have to change, and it may be a different kind of a text based on the economic and political reality of the country then. And that's how any country works.
Right. Wonderful. So this answer has made my job both easier and difficult. easier. Why? Because it has sort of summarized and answered most of my curiosity when it comes to how exactly is PIT performing and all. Difficult. Why? Because most of my subsequent questions were sort of allegations to how Indian BIT is protectionist in nature. But nonetheless, I think what you've said is very interesting, and the only reference that I can draw from my limited knowledge is to what Rumana Islam writes continuously on developing countries and the status of FET clauses that have been included and how it is interpreted when the one of the parties to the arbitration is a developing country and what impact it has. So in this context, I think my only substantial question in this part of the conversation would be that there is an allegation from the people, and I would like to run this by you to have a rather specific answer to that. Is that Indian BIT is protectionist in nature, wherein it has a different sort of an definition for investment. It has a very different FET clause where it only talks about the minimum treatment standard. And so, what is it, and why is it that India has sort of uh, adopted this form of a model BIT? Is it because of all the reasons that you've already shared with us, or is it some other possible reason that we should be aware of?
No, so when the model BIT in 2015, when there was a revision, you can see the manner in which it was done. First, let me highlight that the manner in which it was done was there was a consultation with experts. Some experts were consulted. The model BIT was drafted. Then the draft model BIT there was a report by the Law Commission on the draft model BIT. They made certain recommendations. Then subsequently the draft model BIT was also placed on the MyGov website for public stakeholder consultations. So it was a transparent process where the draft, even before it was finalized, was put in the public forum, and views were taken from across the world. When the government decides to put a text on MyGov, it's open for the entire world to respond. And I've seen this recent trend. Even I think the Canadians did the same thing with their model BIT. I've seen recently that Australians also, welcome views on their model BIT. So we have a transparent system as a democracy, and that was followed, and the model BIT came into place. Here again, we must remember that the model BIT is a negotiation text. And there will always be room for negotiations. But a country is well within its sovereign right to say this is what we envisage to be the model for us, and that's what has happened. So that let's just to put that in context. Now, regarding the specific points about what you have raised concerning, like for example, the minimum standard treatment. This is not something unique to India. Minimum standard treatment, you can see the origin of that comes from NAFTA. The NAFTA investment chapter always spoke of minimum standard of treatments, and the negotiation, the member countries of NAFTA, that is the United States, Canada, and Mexico, have often clarified and given restrictive interpretation of that minimum standard of treatment, linking it to customary international law. Now, if you see the origin of minimum standard of treatment, it was way prior to the BITs coming into force. In the early 20th century, there was a discussion, first of all, whether there is a minimum standard of treatment. And many countries refused that there is not even a minimum standard of treatment. All right. There is a famous Calvo doctrine, which the South American countries followed. And they said, if you are investing in my country, if you are participating in my economy, if you're going to use the labor from my country, if you're going to use resources from my country, you want to use the laws of my country, but you say you want special treatment. They
Right.
said that won't happen. We are going to give you national treatment. You come here, you'll be treated as good as any domestic company is treated. But the tendency, because capital exporting countries were not comfortable with that, and they felt that no, there should be some minimum standard, and that led to the growth of the BITs to establish that minimum standard. And it should actually be welcomed. Now, for example, if India says that we follow minimum standard of treatment and make reference to customary international law, you're creating state practice. It shows that India is accepting that there is a customary international law minimum standard. and only that, and the standard exists. It's welcoming.
Mhm.
The fair and equitable treatment article was too broad. And now globally, if you see Kaustubh, you see any of the recent treaties, whether it's TPP, which is, some claim to be the gold standard. The member countries of TPP claim that that's the gold standard. The people who negotiated RCEP will claim that's the diamond standard. But the point is that everyone is going towards that minimum standard of treatment because they recognize that the terms fair and equitable, though are welcoming, and no doubt one should be fair and equitable, leaving it open to interpretation, such terms leads to sometimes leads to such interpretations beyond which the negotiation, the sovereign countries who negotiated those treaties intended. And that is the reason that you have the minimum standard, and listing it out specifically that these are the minimum standards we're talking about. And if you see those minimum standards in the model BIT, they are, I think, they cover most of the concerns of any foreign investor.
Right, right, sir. And I think what you said is very interesting because FET, as some scholars suggest, is just an addendum to the minimum standard of treatment. Some say that FET can be autonomous. It could be a shopping list sort of a clause, like some particular BITs have out there. Except there have been traditional NAFTA FET clauses which have made a reference to customary international law in general, which I think blurs the line between minimum standard of treatment, just cogence, and what FET has been. But very specifically, if there is to be a higher threshold for, let's say, violation of clauses like DOJ, denial of justice, or let's say there is a violation of arbitrariness or something of that sort, and if it were to happen, why not list it down in the minimum standard treatment itself and rather make a confusing reference? I think that's a very interesting take, sir.
Yeah, I think, as I said, this is not just India, but if you map any of the recent agreements globally, that's been the case. It's just that I feel at times India becomes a soft target, but it's a global practice. As far as minimum standard is concerned, I think today most countries agree with that. And the origin was there in the 90s when NAFTA was the one that introduced minimum standard of treatment. So here again, we must remember that BITs were a European invention, and the Europeans were the one who negotiated a lot of these bilateral investment treaties. But introducing investment liberalization, introducing investment chapter as a part of a free trade agreement, introduction of certain restrictions like minimum standard, etc., was a contribution by the United States and Canada, and it's reflected in the Canadian model, for example, or the recent CAFTA. If you see any of the agreements or the CETA between EU Canada, you will see minimum standard of treatment there.
Right, sir. And in fact, it is SETA only that makes a very interesting choice of words when they list down the grounds of FET violation very specifically, and then converts the legitimate expectation part and making it only to specific references being drawn by the host state through any investors, and then subsequently also making a point that those legitimate expectation does not allow the parties to bring a claim against something that was done under right to regulate, that was done for the public policy, which is an interesting mix of things. You are a developed country, you're supposed to be making and inviting investment, but also making a stronghold. And then the criticism comes again back to the developing countries, not Canada, but India. When India attempts to do something of this sort, when that India wants to make a clause which is substantially strong for a host state, which again is a negotiation tool, as you've already suggested, it becomes a criticizing point by its own media.
No, absolutely, absolutely. It's there are individuals who are doing it, but the point is, it's an attempt. It's always good to have healthy criticism, positive criticism, and there's in my mind, there's no doubt that it may not be a perfect document for every negotiation. These are bilateral, relationships that countries have. So any treaty must reflect that the reality of that relationship. And that's why I said, when two developed countries are negotiating, they're willing to even drop the investment arbitration mechanism. But India, whether we have negotiated with a developing country, whether India has negotiated with the developed country, you will see that India is more consistent in that manner. It's in line with our spirit and our understanding of international law. If you see, earlier we were part of NAM, even now, we try to be neutral, and we are well respected in the both in the developed countries circle and in the developing countries circle, because India has maintained that kind of a balance. So this model BIT is an attempt towards that. And and one cannot, quantity cannot be the only criteria to see success, right? Me having 30 or 100 treaties is not the relevant sign, according to me, of whether there has been a successful negotiation. A successful negotiation is where both sides have end up agreeing to a treaty which helps both the countries and balances the interests of the states and the investors. Having a skewed treaty and successfully negotiating it, and having 100 treaties, which India did before. At that time it was required, we had 90 treaties. But if you see the United States, or if you see many of the developed countries, they have fewer treaties. They don't sign treaties with everyone. They were targeted treaties, and generally the developed countries entered into these treaties with developing countries. It's very clear. I mean, one cannot forget the historical background. One should not also. We are defined by that as well. We know how these capital exporting countries have that capital today. There is a history behind it. There is colonial history why they have all this capital. Now they accumulated all the capital, and then they say the conditions for you receiving back this capital that we accumulated through exploitation of the developing countries will be in this manner. Despite that, and that's the beauty of it, despite that, the developing countries understand, no one is looking to be a revolutionary. They're participating in the system, they are negotiating the treaties, and they also legitimately believe. And if you see India as a state, as a sovereign state, our consistently we have respected international law. Consistently we have. There may be some outlier cases which are which may be mandated for other reasons, because international law itself keeps changing over time. There is a temporal change that temporal change brings about change in international law as well. But the point is, you see recently the Italian Marines case, India respected the tribunal decision. The Supreme Court ended the case there and then. When you see India's decision with Bangladesh, where much one would say that we lost that case to a large extent, because Bangladesh got a larger chunk of the Bay of Bengal, but we accepted that. Unlike some of our neighbors who are not who have no respect for international law and try to dictate terms to everyone by might. India is not like that, and to portray it in that manner is it's easy to do. And government, due to its nature, to the very nature of government, how large it is, and the secrets that are there, because they're bound by official secrets, there are so many other concerns. They cannot respond to every statement, or else, I mean, I'm sure that the government has its reasons. I'm not here as a spokesperson of the government, but this is the reality. Having what I have seen is, it may not be perfect, but the intentions are genuine.
Right.
They're bona fide.
Right, sir. I think I can keep having this conversation for as long as, in fact, if it were to me, I could actually make this conversation chapter by chapter about every aspect of international investment treaty, talking from one aspect to the other. But there's so much I can take away from your time, sir. So I'll try to conclude this conversation now. It's been absolutely wonderful, the opportunity to speak with you and to learn about, especially investment arbitration, something that I absolutely love, and everyone who is interested in would absolutely love this episode. To what lens you have gone to how in depth your answers were. Thank you so much, sir, for that. And for anyone who, by the way, is curious about this Bangladesh land dispute that India had with, I've had a conversation with Mr. Zafar Khurshid about a similar topic. He wrote an article on, which you can find in the description. Nonetheless, thank you so much, sir. Before we wrap this conversation up, do you have any closing remarks?
No, it was. Thank you for having me, and I hope I was able to address the queries you had. This is a ever evolving field, and there's a lot of opportunities for many, all of us and all young lawyers to explore this field and contribute.
Right, sir.
So thank you once again.
Thank you so much. It was truly an honor, and I absolutely am looking forward to the nearest possible opportunity where I can speak with you again and possibly host you on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much for your time, sir.